None Dare Call It Treason by John A. Stormer. About the author. John Stormer is, like most young Americans who grew up during the Depression, the product of a conservative home and a liberal education. In the late 1950s, he gradually came to realize that the political candidates and philosophies he was asked to support in the voting booth did not reflect the standards and principles he tried to apply in his business and personal life. He started an intensive study of communism about 4 years ago, and since then has lectured on college campuses, addressed hundreds of churches, civic, political, and service organizations, and appeared frequently on radio and television programs. A frequent visitor to Washington, D.C., he has been a regular participant in conferences and meetings on the inroads made by communism and socialism in America. In 1962, he left a successful career as editor and general manager of a leading electrical magazine to devote full time to conservative, anti-communist activities. He is a Chamberlain of the Missouri Federation of Young Republicans and a member of the Republican State Committee of Missouri. A native of Altoona, Pennsylvania, he attended the Pennsylvania State University and graduated from the California's San Jose State College in 1954 after Korean War service as an Air Force historian. He is a member of Sigma Delta Chi, the Professional Journalism Society, attends a fundamental Christian church, and has received awards for anti-communism educational activities from Rotary, the Knights of Columbus, and other civic groups. Treason doth never prosper. What's the reason? For if it prosper, none dare call it treason. Sir John Harington, 1561 to 1612. Chapter 1. Have we gone crazy? As long as capitalism and socialism exist, we cannot live in peace. In the end, one or the other will triumph. A funeral dirge will be sung over either the Soviet republics or over world capitalism. V. I. Lenin. The Cold War is real war. It has already claimed more lives, enslaved more people, and cost more money than any hot war in history. Yet most Americans refuse to admit that we are at war. That is why we are rapidly losing. Why America has yet to win its first real victory in 18 years of Cold War. Within the framework of the Cold War, there have been hot wars in China, Malaya, Indonesia, Algeria, the Congo, Cuba, Iraq, the Gaza Strip, Hungary, Korea, Angola, Burma, Tibet, and Egypt. In 1963, there was fighting in Laos, Vietnam, and on the Indian-Chinese border, renewed skirmishing along the 38th parallel in Korea, and terrorist activity in Africa. The forces of freedom have lost or will lose them all. There has been no big war because the communists are winning without one. In 1945, the communists held 160 million Russians in slavery. They controlled a land area smaller than the Russia of the Tsars. Soviet industry had been largely destroyed by the Nazi war machine. Communism was a third-rate power, militarily, industrially, and economically. Today, after the United States has spent $600 billion to fight communism and sacrifice the lives of 50,000 of its youth to thwart red aggression, the Kremlin has grown to become the absolute slave masters of 1 billion human beings. The communists openly control 25% of the Earth's landmass. Their puppet, Fidel Castro, has been installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from our shores. The hidden tentacles of the communist conspiracy exert unmeasured influence over the rest of the world. Where have we failed? Almost unnoticed by most Americans, Congress, while appropriating billions for defense against communism, has at the same time given over $6 billion in direct military and economic aid to the communists. Here are examples. Radar-equipped F-86 jet fighter planes worth over $300,000 each have been sold to the communist dictator of Yugoslavia for $10,000. This sale to Tito has been defended because both the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations approved it. The planes were said to be obsolete. Yet, during the Berlin crisis, reactivated U.S. Air National Guard units flew to possible battle against communists in Europe in even more obsolete F-84 jets. Nikita Khrushchev has said that peaceful coexistence involves peaceful economic competition. Our leaders agree, and place great emphasis on this aspect of the Cold War in urging disarmament. Why then has the United States supplied nuclear reactors to the communist government of Czechoslovakia, railway equipment to Bulgaria, chemical plants to Yugoslavia, and synthetic rubber plants to Soviet Russia? Why has America given Russian machinery to produce the precision ball bearings used in the guided missile they rattle during every international crisis? Why has America built the world's most modern, most highly automated steel finishing plant for the communist government of Poland? Constructed in Warren, Ohio, the plant was dedicated as the Lenin Steelworks by the U.S. ambassador to Poland in July 1961. The American people lent the communists $2.5 million to pay for it. The examples are endless. The failure of Russian agriculture has historically been communism's weakest link. So, in 1961, officials in the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Commerce Department agreed to sell surplus wheat to the Soviet Union for 62 cents per bushel less than the baker who bakes your bread pays for it. Only quick action by an awakening public stopped this folly, for which would have supplied wheat to ease food shortages and the resultant unrest against the communists in the Soviet Union. The officials who initiated the program are still holding responsible government positions. Much American aid to communists is hidden in U.S. grants to the United Nations and its specialized agencies. For example, the United Nations Special Fund is giving Castro, the communist dictator of Cuba, funds to bolster his agricultural programs. The American who heads the fund, Paul Hoffman, approved the grant, and the U.S. taxpayer is paying 40% of the total bill of $1.6 million. The grant was made just after the attempted invasion of Cuba failed in April 1961. Is it any wonder that Nikita Khrushchev predicted confidently in a speech in Bucharest, Romania, on June 19, 1962 that the United States will eventually fly the communist red flag, the American people will hoist it themselves. The communists have sworn to bury us. We are digging our own graves. Does aid to communism make sense? If, during World War II, anyone had suggested sending food or industrial materials to Nazi Germany, they would have been tried for treason or carted off to a mental institution. Today, favoring aid to communism is, to some, evidence of good mental health. After years of such folly, where do we stand today in the battle from which Lenin, first head of communist Russia, said there could be no coexistence, that either capitalism or socialism would emerge triumphant? Senator Thomas Judd, Democrat from Connecticut, is a former FBI man. He's vice chairman of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee and a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Speaking in Los Angeles, California on August 28, 1961, just 8 months after President Kennedy was inaugurated, Senator Dodd said, "There is a developing mood of anger and frustration in this country, and there ought to be, for we are losing round after round in the Cold War, and our people do not like it. At the close of World War II, our forces stood triumphant on the land and sea and in the air. We had at our command the mightiest array of military power in all history. Yet the last 16 years have witnessed a calamitous retreat from victory. During all these years, we have suffered defeat after defeat at the hands of international communism. We have retreated from position after position and committed folly after folly." Senator Dodd explained that because such defeats and retreats took place in faraway lands such as Latvia, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, China, Korea, and Indochina, Americans were inclined to feel smug and secure. Then he continued, "But in December 1958, what many people had considered impossible came to pass. While we stood by in confusion and disarray and apparent helplessness, a communist dictator was installed on the island of Cuba, only 90 miles off our own shores. In 1959, Tibet was brutally annexed by the Chinese communists, despite, again, the anguished protests of free men throughout the world. Since the beginning of this year, 1961 alone, there's been the sealing off of East Berlin, the disaster in Laos, the fiasco in Cuba, and only last week, the victory of Cheddi Jagan and his communist-dominated People's Progressive Party in British Guiana elections. Everywhere we are on the defensive, everywhere we find ourselves being pushed back. We have retreated so far that we now stand perilously close to the brink of total disaster." How close are we to this disaster? The total enslavement of the world? Senator Dodd gave this evaluation. "Last December, I was privileged to speak in the city of Paris, and at the time I said if there were another 15 years like the last 15 years, there would be no more free world left to defend. In the light of what has happened over the intervening 8 months since I made the observation in Paris, I feel compelled to revise that timetable. I do not believe we have 15 years left. The next 5 years will contain a series of decisive battles which will determine for centuries to come whether mankind is to live in freedom or live in slavery. We stand now, my friends, with our backs to the precipice. We have no more ground to give, no time to lose, no margin for error. Since Senator Dodd issued that warning in August 1961, America has yielded further ground. The Congo, Algeria, Dutch New Guinea, Laos, Vietnam, Cuba, Brazil, and the Dominican Republic have had the tentacles of communism drawn more tightly about their throats. Senator Dodd was not the first to speak out. The warning has been issued many times. Several years ago, General Albert C. Wedenmayer, Chief of Strategic Planners during World War II, appeared before the House Committee on Un-American Activities for a consultation. Wedenmayer was asked, based on your background and experience and current studies of the operation of this conspiracy, how late is it on the communist timetable for world domination? Richard C. Aarons, staff director of the Congressional Committee, reported that Wedenmayer dropped his eyes to the floor, looked up, and said, "Sir, my humble, honest judgment is that it is too late." Before it was printed, Wedenmayer edited his testimony. He struck out the words and wrote, "I am not completely a pessimist, but it is very, very late. If I were the senior planner in the Soviet hierarchy, I would advise Khrushchev, continue to do exactly what you are doing now. Do not involve the Soviet Union in major war, but employ the satellites in brush fires or limited wars against our enemies, the capitalist countries." This is just what has happened. Khrushchev has threatened nuclear war to get his way. He has employed the satellites in brush fires in Tibet, Laos, Vietnam, Algeria, the Congo, and most recently on the Indian-Chinese border. Consider the sobering implications of Cuba in the perspective of the following words. Written in 1951, they are based on a study of communist sources. Communist strategy teaches that there can be no successful revolution followed by the creation of Soviets in any Latin American country unless an internal revolution has been effected within the United States. The Comintern views the Western Hemisphere as an integral unit in which the United States must be first rendered helpless before a Soviet-type government can be established in any of the other 20 republics in the hemisphere. Part of a study on Latin American communist activities, this analysis was published by the House Committee on Un-American Activities in a volume entitled Soviet Total War. It was issued on September 30th, 1956, almost 2.5 years before Fidel Castro established the first Soviet-type government in the Western Hemisphere. Could the American government possibly have been rendered helpless in the struggle against world communism, or is this official analysis wrong? In 1961, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee issued a 12-volume study entitled Communist Threat to the U.S. Through the Caribbean. It showed conclusively that Castro could not have brought communism to Cuba except for the continual aid and assistance of the U.S. State Department. Even so, the State Department personnel implicated by the Senate study as being directly involved in Castro's rise to power still held important State Department jobs 2 years later. William Wylad, a man branded as either a damn fool or a communist before the Senate committee, has been promoted to the highest foreign service rank and pay. As head of the State Department Caribbean desk, Wylad has received and buried continuing intelligence reports which indicated that Castro was a communist. After the U.S. Senate revealed this and other derogatory information, Wylad was promoted into the State Department Committee studying a revision of security practices. He was still employed in the State Department as of February 23, 1963. Wylad is not an isolated case. John Stewart Service, a career diplomat, was arrested by the FBI on June 7, 1945 for passing secret documents to Soviet espionage agents. He was deeply involved in the communist influence web in the State Department, which lost China to communism. In the early 1950s, Service was dismissed, but the Supreme Court, without questioning his guilt, ordered him reinstated in 1956. The court's decision was based on the technicality that proper procedures had not been used in firing him. At first assigned to the menial task of handling baggage for diplomats, Service started working his way back up the State Department ladder. By 1961, he occupied a key diplomatic post in Liverpool, England. In 1962, he retired, and is now drawing a pension from the American taxpayers. Owen Lattimore was deeply involved in the betrayal of China to the communists in the late 1940s. In 1952, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee found him to have been a conscious, articulate instrument of the Soviet conspiracy for 15 years. In May 1961, he was granted a passport to go to Outer Mongolia, a communist satellite. When questioned by newsmen, the State Department said, "He's not there as an official representative, of course, but we are anxious to get his impressions." 4 months after Latimore's return to America, the U.S. agreed to admit Outer Mongolia to the United Nations. No one denies these facts, they're just ignored. Is it possible, in view of these facts, that the United States government has been rendered helpless in the struggle with communism? It did happen once. The grave question which few appear willing to face today is, could it happen again? 20 years ago, similar warning signs were uncovered by the FBI and congressional investigating committees. In the 8 years after which passed before the alarms were finally heeded, Alger Hiss had reached a high State Department post and sat at FDR's side. He was there at Yalta when decisions were made which ultimately committed 700 million human beings to communist enslavement. Harry Dexter White, as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, controlled all fiscal matters in which foreign policy was involved. Nathan Witt, as Secretary of the National Labor Relations Board, was the board's top executive officer. He controlled board proceedings and all hiring and firing of NLRB employees. Board actions under Witt's direction were deciding factors in many labor management negotiations across the country. Lee Pressman was general counsel of the WPA. John J. Abbott was a special assistant to the Attorney General. Lachlan Curry was executive assistant to President Roosevelt. All were identified before congressional committees as communist agents. High government officials ignored authoritative reports that these men, and others in equally high places, were Soviet agents. Some warnings came as long as 8 years before the conspirators were publicly exposed. Could such infiltration of American government happen again? Has it happened? We can't know. In 1954, an order by the president who had pledged to clean up the mess in Washington reiterated earlier gag rules, which placed security files of executive department employees, about 98% of all federal employees, firmly off limits to congressional investigating committees. The job of uncovering future security risk was thus made nearly impossible. In a nutshell, America as a nation, and you as an individual, are in trouble. A look at the shrinking map of the free world confirms the warnings of responsible leaders. The future of Americans as a free people is threatened. The continued refusal of elected officials to rid the government service of the Weilands, the Services, the Latimores, for whatever reason, tells why. What can we do? A responsible person must first gather information on which to base his judgment and actions. Motivations without knowledge produces fanaticism. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, has told us, attributing every adversity to communism is not only irrational, but contributes to hysteria and fosters groundless fears. Communism is indeed our paramount adversary, and it leans on its credo of invincibility to accomplish its ends. The way to fight is to study it, understand it, and discover what can be done about it. This cannot be achieved by dawdling at the spring of knowledge. It can only be accomplished by dipping into thoughtful, reliable, and authoritative sources of information. The study of communism must be approached objectively. For too long, Americans have been paralyzed by politics. They have seen only the mistakes, errors, and omissions of the opposition political party. Leaders of both parties have been at fault. Members of both political parties have blindly supported their own party leadership, and nothing has been done about the very real menace which threatens America. It is not enough to assess blame or point an accusing finger at past or present political leaders. The guilt also belongs to those apathetic Americans who have ignored warning after warning and let this chain of events continue. The past mistakes, and there are many, must be spotlighted so similar errors can be avoided in the future. That was Chapter 1 of None Dare Call It Treason.